Welcome to a new edition of TeachTalk, a project of Creative Universities. Today, I will be talking to Marylynn Steckley, who teaches International and Global Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Hi, Marylynn. So nice to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, it's so nice to see you too. Thank you for welcoming me to this awesome space.
Brilliant. So first of all, what is your background and who, where, and what do you teach?
So I am a development geographer by training. And right now I'm an assistant professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, which is in Canada. And I teach on a number of subjects, largely climate change, ethics, but I've also been a big part of my faculty's international experience requirement. So the stream of experiential learning that students need to take if they're in our program. And so I've been involved in kind of the virtual and international placements, the courses that go with that, e-volunteering. But I think what I want to share most today is my class, which is a virtual experiential learning course that focuses on craft as a social relation. So that's what I want to share about today.
Brilliant, brilliant. Before we get to this, can you tell me a bit more kind of in general what this idea of critical creative teaching means to you and how it relates to your own pedagogical practice?
I've sort of come into this kind of pedagogical domain by happenstance and just emerging interest. So it's not my disciplinary background, and only by kind of learning how I wanted to engage more with students in an experiential way and kind of taking the whole person in mind, but maintaining kind of a critical theory perspective, including like part of my priorities in teaching are always historicizing what we're talking about. So thinking about place, space, and scale are really important concepts in geography, and thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how everything that we do has these hidden social relations involved in it. So that's kind of my background, but I never really thought about it as critical creative pedagogies until I started getting more into the literature on pedagogies in global studies. So I'm definitely no expert in kind of the theory beyond this, but those are kind of my broad objectives, is to think about the students' kind of whole self and all of our whole selves as we engage together, and to really maintain a spirit of coming to the class with sort of sharp intellect and critiquing everything that we engage in experientially, kind of through the lens of social relations. Largely for me, the basic of that means starting with gender, race, and class. And then we can also interrogate kind of ability, ageism, all of those other concepts.
So yeah, can you share some examples of how you do that in your classroom and how your students are learning from your teaching?
Sure. So I think the class I'm sort of most excited about is it's called Craft as a Global Social Relation. And it's one of the ways that students in our program can fulfill their experiential learning kind of program component or requirement. And this class emerged for me during COVID because I was trying to figure out ways that we could maintain global connections without travel and maintain experiential learning, meaningful experiential learning, without oftentimes being able to leave our homes, because for us, we were in lockdown a lot of the time. So I started kind of thinking about this, and I was subscribing to the New York Times at that time. And in the book review, they had this book, Craft in American History by Glenn Adamson. And I just totally consumed that book and the ideas expressed in it, which are that craft and skill have made North America. It's through innovation that we have become the society that we are. And a lot of that is built up in kind of discourses of individualism and the self-made man, which I think are really important to interrogate. But I also kind of started exploring, what does this mean, craft, and how does that craft history? So traditionally that meant like carpenters, cobblers, blacksmiths. How has that history tied into displacement of Indigenous people, gender disparities and gender equity, racism, and slavery? how do those two histories kind of coincide, and what does that mean for today? So there's a scholar, I think her name is Kathy Costin, if I'm getting that right, in California, who said basically everything that we have today, everything that we interact with is a result of craft, is a result of skilled makers and creators doing things with their hands and producing what we have today. But it used to be that we could see, like, we engaged in community with people who were creating things like our kitchen table or our shoes, and they were all part of our community. And now the social relations are hidden within the craft that we have. So for me, that kind of clandestine social relations that is hidden in our pottery mug or in our kitchen table or whatever it is that's in our house is really important. And the slow globalization and commodification of all things, when we kind of uncover it, it sort of implodes in gender relations, race relations, class relations, but they become invisible to us. And, you know, in global studies, we think about this a lot in terms of like sweatshop labor or, you know, outsourcing large companies to other places so that we don't know about, you know, the ecological imprint or the social imprint of the chocolate we consume or the goods that we buy that could have been made, you know, in many low-income countries in environmentally degrading ways. So that's kind of the intellectual part that I'm starting with. And I want students to come to the class and embody the craft. So our class is kind of built around a number of components. They do a reading that is related to the craft, and the reading explores a particular craft and usually hits on one of the gender, race, class, environment, ability themes that I just talked about. And then we have workshops with leaders from around the world where we are actually engaging in the craft that they're an expert in. So to give you some examples, we had a Bollywood dance class and a Bengali cooking class, and we learned about caste and social hierarchies in both Indian classical dance and in Bengali food. We had an Indigenous hoop dancer, and we learned about kind of Indigenous stewardship with the land and how that plays into the creation of the hoop dance, and how family is a huge part of how hoop dancing is practiced and passed on. And we also had an Indigenous potter, so we learned about how stewardship is embodied through pottery, but how pottery can also be a source of activism. What else did we had? We had an Uzbek zine artist. I always forget if it's zine or zine. I think it's zine.
Zine, yeah.
So, yeah. So she led us through kind of the creation of our individual zines and taught us about the history of Uzbekistan. We made sushi with a Japanese sushi maker and learned about, you know, the gender dynamics of sushi and how it's tends to be masculine chefs who create it. So we engaged in all of these workshops. And then we also had global mental health embodiment activities. So this is where the whole person comes into being. So each morning we would gather together and we would sort of remind ourselves, because we're all on Zoom, right? Like everybody's exhausted with Zoom. So we did things together like meditation, we did yoga, we did Tai Chi, the Japanese had this tradition of radio taisu. So it's kind of like calisthenics, but they play it on the radio every morning, and like much of the nation is involved in this kind of this calisthenics kind of exercise. We did a Finnish cold shower, sisu cold shower, in the physicality and our emotional selves in the class as well. And all of these things, I was really afraid the first time I ran the course because, you know, you're afraid of technology, communication. Are the workshop leaders going to be able to show up on time? All of those things. But so much is possible in the virtual environment. And like we even went on a community run together, connecting by phone in two different ways. The first time I ran it as sort of a field school. So it was a 12-day immersive experience where we spent the whole day together. We started at 8:30, ended at 4-ish. And the other way was through the traditional, it was this past winter semester, like weekly sessions. I really think the field school worked better because we were really trying to mimic an immersive experience, and we could break up the days. So we started with our mental health embodiment then we did our reading discussion, then we had our workshop, then we had kind of a practice and brainstorming session for their final project. But I could help kind of navigate the day by thinking about, have I moved? Have I eaten? Have I had, coffee and food? And so I was able to kind of guide our whole selves throughout the day. And I think students really liked it. I felt a greater sense of community in that format. And I think I sort of want to push back on this idea that transformation depends on travel in global study. And really for me, that was one of the worries. Is this really experiential learning? Can I really get students to, feel deeply, even in the connection by Zoom? And the responses from both groups were overwhelmingly like, this was such a positive experience. This is, they said things like, this is the first course where I've really been able to connect theory to practice and bring myself into the course. And those kinds of responses were super meaningful to me and helped me think about how I can continue to advocate for, virtual experiential learning. To me is important because of the equity component as well. So a lot of my work is in my emerging research and pedagogy is trying to create spaces that are equitable and accessible for all students. And in global studies, the reality is it tends to be white, wealthy students who are more likely to be able to travel, engage in, unpaid co-ops and internships elsewhere, or expensive UN co-op placements or study abroad. And so part of my objective is to create either free or low cost experiential learning options that are going to be meaningful for students and improve inclusivity in our degree program. So I think that this course, like I sort of went into it like, does it do this? Like you don't really know until you've gone through it a couple of times, right? But the student responses I found really heartening. Yeah. And you can feel the connection, and then they have relationships outside of the class, and the participation was strong. So
yeah,